wind slicing from the Absaroka Range carried a sharp bite, even late in the summer. It whispered through the lodge poles and Douglas firs, bringing the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and a raw, primal note that snagged at Laurie's senses like burrs on wool. She crouched low behind a granite outcrop, the coarse stone pressing against her cheek. 200 yards downhill, a herd of elk grazed in a meadow silvered by the late afternoon sun. This was their life now. The edges were sharp, comforts were few, but it belonged to them. They lived on the fringes, holding their breath tight against the world outside. Laurie served as the anchor, the one who kept the frayed ends from completely unraveling. Her hair, the color of river mud, she usually pulled back in a tight braid, practical for slipping through brush or keeping out of her eyes during a run. Her face was lean, weathered by sun and wind, etched with a weariness that had sunk deep into her bones. She wasn't old in years, but the time they had spent living like this, always looking over their shoulder, always listening, had aged her spirit. Beside her, a little too close for Laurie's liking, Caleb shifted. He was a big man in his human form, all muscle and bone. His movements held a restless, contained energy that hummed just beneath his skin. Caleb experienced the wilderness differently than Laurie did. For him, it was a cage as much as it was a refuge. He craved the structure of a pack, the easy camaraderie, the shared purpose. Being out here, just the three of them, felt like a constant, low-grade punishment. He possessed power, undeniable power, a force of nature when the change took him, but he was also headstrong, quick to anger, quicker still to dismiss anything he didn't understand or couldn't muscle his way through. Laurie felt the tension radiating off him, a low growl that never quite made it past his lips. Ellis was somewhere else. Not physically, not yet. She remained back near their hidden camp, a crude shelter tucked into a rock overhang draped with thick moss and low-hanging branches. But her mind, her senses, often traveled miles away. Drifting on currents Laurie couldn't feel. Hearing whispers Laurie couldn't hear. Ellis was the youngest, barely more than a girl when they were first forced out. The change had hit her differently, too. It wasn't just the physical shift, the elongation of bone and the sprouting of fur, but something deeper, something in her head, in her connection to the world. She was intuitive, almost uncannily so, but also fragile, sometimes lost in whatever unseen currents pulled at her. Her eyes, usually the color of lake water, would sometimes cloud over, distant, as if looking at something far beyond the jagged peaks surrounding them. "They're fat," Caleb murmured, his voice low and rough. He stated the observation as a fact about the elk, a hunter's appraisal. Laurie nodded, her eyes fixed on the herd. One bull, not a cow with a calf. Their rules were simple, born of necessity and a desperate need to hold on to some scrap of decency. They hunted only what they needed. They left no trace. They never touched a human. Tourists, rangers, researchers, they were unseen to be avoided at all costs. They moved like smoke, smelled like the wind. It was a constant, exhausting performance. Every shifted hair, every lingering scent, every misplaced footprint was a death sentence. They were wilder out here, stripped down to the bone of what they were, but also more vulnerable. The raw, untamed power of the shift felt less like a gift, and more like a dangerous secret that could betray them at any moment. They were out here for reasons tangled in fear and principle. Laurie had seen something she shouldn't have, heard things that went against the established order of things. Caleb had backed her, his loyalty fierce and absolute, though he never quite understood the nuances of the politics that had exiled them. Ellis had always been apart, sensing things that unsettled the pack elders. They became a threat, or perhaps just inconvenient. It didn't matter then. The bridges were burned. The world of other shifters was as inaccessible to them as the world of humans. They were adrift. Yellowstone became their reluctant sanctuary. Its sheer, overwhelming scale provided their best defense. Hundreds of miles of wilderness offered enough room to get lost in, to disappear. The forests stood like ancient cathedrals of pine and spruce. The rivers ran cold and fast, carving deep canyons into the earth. But the park's hidden heart, the geothermal activity, both fascinated and terrified Lori. Boiling mud pots bubbled like viscous nightmares, fumaroles hissed steam into the clear air, hot springs glowed the color of jewels or dried blood. The ground itself felt alive here, humming with a deep, primeval power. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way, but it was also deadly. A single wrong step sent one plunging into scalding water or through a thin crust into boiling muck. It was the perfect place to hide, a place that swallowed secrets whole. Lori signed to Caleb with a flick of her wrist. Wait. He grumbled something under his breath, impatient. She ignored him. This wasn't about him. Something was wrong back at camp. She felt the edges of Ellis's unease, a faint ripple on the surface of her own senses. It wasn't the usual low-level anxiety that accompanied Ellis's strange connection to things. This felt different, sharper, more insistent. They bagged the elk after sunset, working quickly, efficiently, using minimal tools. The scent of fresh blood flew as a dangerous banner in the night air, but the cooling temperatures helped contain it. By the time they reached the overhang camp, packing the meat wrapped in waterproof canvas, the air had turned cold and still. Ellis huddled by the small, carefully managed fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't watch the flames. Her head tilted, listening to something Lori couldn't hear. Her eyes, wide and dark in the firelight, were unfocused. Ellis? Lori's voice was quiet. Ellis flinched, startled from a deep concentration. She looked at Lori, her gaze slowly clearing. It's stronger, she whispered, her voice thin. Caleb dumped his pack of meat on the ground with a thud. What's stronger, El? The wind? My belly rumbling. He tried for humor, but it landed flat. Ellis shook her head, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Not outside. Underneath. She tapped the ground with a trembling finger. The earth. It's vibrating. Not like a tremor. Not like the caldera breathing. Lori knelt beside her. What does it feel like? Like a pulse, Ellis said, her voice barely audible. But wrong. A slow, heavy beat deep down and sound, not through my ears, through my bones. A low hum and voices. Lori felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. Voices? What kind of voices? Ellis squeezed her eyes shut, shivering. Not words. More like feelings, pictures. Old. So old. And hurt. A deep, deep hurt. Like the earth is crying. She opened her eyes. They were dark with fear. It's coming from that way. She gestured vaguely towards the heart of the park, towards the most active geothermal zones, the ones closest to the vast, slumbering supervolcano underfoot. Towards the parts rangers warned tourists about, marked on maps with stark red boundaries, towards the Valley of Steam and Sighs. Caleb snorted. Great. The kid's hearing rocks talk now. It's probably just a new vent opening up. Or you ate something weird. It's not that, Caleb, Ellis insisted, her voice gaining a little strength. It's calling. Not for me, not exactly, but it's pulling. It feels important, like if we don't go, something terrible will happen, or we'll miss something we need to know. Lori looked at Ellis's face, saw the genuine terror mixed with a strange, compelling pull in her eyes. She knew Ellis wasn't making this up. Her intuition, unsettling as it sometimes was, had saved them more than once. But going towards the heavy geothermal areas, that was suicide for humans, let alone for them. The boiling water, the toxic fumes, the thin, unstable crust over pools of molten rock, and the sheer risk of being seen. Those areas were patrolled, monitored. That's too dangerous, Lori said gently, her heart already sinking. She knew, looking at Ellis's set jaw, that she wasn't going to let this go. We have to, Ellis pleaded, grabbing Lori's arm. Her small hand felt unnaturally strong. Lori, please. It feels like the ground is begging us to come, or warning us. I don't know which, but I can't ignore it. It's part of this. She gestured to herself, to the strange nature of their being. Caleb crossed his arms, leaning against the rock. So what? We just traipse into the middle of the most dangerous part of the park because the kid thinks the dirt's got something to say. It's not dirt, Caleb. Ellis snapped, a rare flash of anger in her eyes. It's old and wrong, and it's calling. It feels like the source of something. Lori felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The source? Of what? Their condition? Their exile? The vague dread that had clung to them for years? Part of her, the pragmatic, survival-oriented part, screamed to stay put. Let the weird vibrations hum and focus on getting through the winter. But another part, a deeper, older instinct, felt a strange resonance with Ellis's words. A wrongness that felt familiar in a horrifying way. If Ellis was right, if this was something important, something that touched on the core of what they were, they could not afford to ignore it. The decision was made not with a handshake or a vote, but with a shared, heavy silence under the vast, star-strewn sky. Ellis's strange pull became their reluctant compass. They would go. They would prepare, pack light, move fast, and pray the steaming, sighing heart of the park didn't swallow them whole before they found what Ellis was feeling. Or worse, before they found out what was feeling them. Lori looked towards the distant, unseen thermal areas, where steam plumed endlessly into the night sky. The wind carried faint, acrid hints of sulfur. But that night, under Ellis's words, it carried something else too. A low, almost imperceptible hum. And if one listened hard enough, perhaps, a faint, ancient whisper. Preparation was a somber affair. Their gear was minimal. Sturdy boots, layered clothing against the unpredictable mountain weather, a small first aid kit, knives, fire starters, water filters, and trail mix they had bartered for months ago from a sympathetic, isolated trapper who asked few questions. They spread out a tattered map on a flat rock, the kind given out at the park entrances, useless for the deep backcountry they preferred, but a faint guide nonetheless. We cut through the eastern ridge, Lori said, tracing a line with a dirt-stained finger. Follow the creek bed as far as it goes. Stay out of the meadows too exposed. Use the tree cover. It was standard operating procedure, refined over years of avoiding detection. They moved through areas tourists shunned. They crossed open spaces at night or in thick fog. They left no sign they were ever there. For them, this was a matter of life and death, not just principle. Getting caught meant questions, tests, labs, cages, things far worse than the forest. Caleb grunted, looking over her shoulder. It gets pretty thick in there. Lots of deadfall. Slows us down. Slow is safe, Lori countered, meeting his gaze. Fast gets you seen. Ellis remained quiet, her attention drawn inward. She held a small, smooth stone she'd found years ago, turning it over and over in her hand. Her focus wasn't on the map. It was on the low thrumming she felt, guiding them like an invisible current. Their journey began before dawn, the air sharp with cold. The first few miles covered familiar territory. Dense pine forests, quiet valleys where deer moved like shadows, the distant sound of a river. They moved with the efficiency of long practice, covering ground silently, reading the signs of the woods. A broken twig that wasn't natural, the faint sweet scent of a bear, the trajectory of a hawk overhead. Their senses, always heightened, went into overdrive, scanning for threats, for anything out of place. As they pushed deeper, the landscape began to change. The forests thinned in places, giving way to rocky slopes and sudden, unexpected clearings. The air grew warmer in patches, carrying the telltale scent of sulfur. Steam began to rise from cracks in the earth, thin tendrils at first, then thicker, more insistent plumes against the pale sky. With the change in landscape came the change in Ellis. Her steps became more purposeful, her eyes fixed on some unseen point ahead. The vibrations she'd felt were no longer faint whispers. They were stronger now, a noticeable tremor underfoot, a persistent hum that resonated not just in her bones, but in her teeth, her skull. Lori and Caleb began to feel it too, though not with Ellis's intensity. For Lori, it was a low-frequency drone in her ears, like distant machinery, constant, relentless. It made her skin prickle, her nerves feel raw. For Caleb, it was a restless unease, an itch under his skin he couldn't scratch, a feeling of being constantly watched, even when his sharp eyes saw nothing. "It's getting louder," Caleb muttered, flexing his hands. The sound seemed to bother him more than Lori. It was a disruption, an irritation to his finely tuned senses. "It's not sound, not really," Ellis said, her voice strained. "It's the earth, breathing. And that other thing, pulsing. It's close now." They entered a section of the park that felt truly ancient, untouched by the modern world. Trees here were gnarled and old, their branches draped with lichen that looked like gray beards. Geologic formations rose around them like abstract sculptures, weathered into strange, unnatural shapes. In places, the rock stained unnatural colors. Sickly yellow, rusty red patches of blinding white calcification. It felt less like wilderness and more like walking through the veins of some colossal sleeping beast. The geothermal activity intensified. The air grew thick with steam and the pungent smell of sulfur. They moved slowly, testing the ground before each step, navigating around bubbling mud pots that gurgled with malevolent life. Fumaroles hissed like angry snakes, venting superheated steam that stripped flesh from bone in seconds. The heat was oppressive in these pockets, even as the air cooled just yards away. It was a constant, terrifying reminder of the immense power simmering just beneath the thin crust of the earth. Navigating these zones was a nightmare. Visibility dropped to near zero in the thickest steam. The ground was treacherous, shifting, and unstable. One minute you were on solid rock, the next your boot sank into scalding mud. The low hum was louder here, a physical presence that vibrated the air itself. It felt like walking on the skin of something alive and deeply uncomfortable. Ellis, despite the visible strain, was the only one who seemed certain of the path. She moved with a strange, almost trance-like certainty, following the pull she felt. Lori watched her, a knot of dread tightening in her gut. This wasn't just curiosity. This was something else. An obligation. A magnetic pull they couldn't resist. Hours bled into one another, the sun climbing and beginning its slow descent. They were exhausted, their muscles aching, their nerves frayed by the constant tension of the landscape and the unending hum. Finally, they reached a place where the steam was impossibly dense, swirling around jagged rock formations like a solid wall. It hung heavy in the air, thick and wet, completely obscuring what lay behind it. This was the heart of the valley of steam and sighs, the place Ellis felt calling them. "It's here," Ellis whispered, her voice hoarse. She stood at the edge of the swirling steam, her hand outstretched as if feeling its texture. Right in the middle. The steam here didn't just rise. It felt contained, almost deliberate, as if it was less a natural phenomenon and more a curtain drawn across something. The air was hot and stifling, filled with the dizzying smell of sulfur. But underneath that, faint and unsettling, was the metallic organic scent Ellis had mentioned. They moved into the steam, swallowed by the gray-white void. Immediately, visibility dropped to a few feet. Sounds were muffled, distorted. The hissing of steam came from all directions at once, creating a disorienting, whispering effect. The ground underfoot was uneven, wet, and treacherously slick. Ellis stopped, holding up a hand. Here. They gathered around her, peering through the swirling mist. At first, Lori saw nothing but rock and steam. Then she noticed something unnatural about the rock face in front of them. It wasn't a sheer cliff. A break in the stone formed a vertical crack, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The dense steam almost perfectly hid it, making it look like just another fold in the rock. But it didn't look like a natural fissure. The edges were too clean in places, too deliberate. And from within the crack, the hum was stronger, a palpable vibration that pushed against their skin. The air spilling out of it felt different, too. Less humid than the surrounding steam, carrying that strange metallic smell, much more distinct now, like old blood, and something synthetic. "Is that it?" Caleb asked, his voice low, tight with apprehension. For all his bravado, even he felt the wrongness of this place. Ellis nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the opening, drawn and terrified at the same time. "It's coming from in there. The pulse. It's loud now." Lori felt a cold dread settle deep in her gut. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run from this place as fast as their legs carried them. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. But Ellis was already moving, drawn forward by the invisible force pulling at her. They followed, stepping through the wall of steam and into the hidden mouth of the earth, leaving the world of sun and trees behind for whatever waited in the dark, pulsing heart of the mountain. The metallic smell washed over them, thick and suffocating. Stepping through the heavy curtain of steam was like entering another world. One moment they were in the hot, wet, choking fog of the geothermal basin. The next, the air was strangely dry and still, though still warm. The transition was abrupt, unsettling. The silence inside was profound, broken only by their own breathing and the faint, distant hiss of the steam outside. And the hum. The low, resonant vibration was stronger in here, felt deep in their bones, a physical pressure against their eardrums. The cave wasn't like any natural cavern Laurie had ever seen, not in the park or anywhere else. The walls weren't rough, fractured stone. They were unnaturally smooth, slick to the touch in places, as if worn down by something other than water or wind. In other spots, the rock was covered in bizarre growths, bulbous formations that looked like petrified organs or strange, calcified fungi. The color was wrong, too. Not the rich browns and grays of natural rock, but muted, sickly shades of off-white pale gray and a disturbing vein-like network of dull reddish-brown. There was no sign of life, no scurrying insects, no bats hanging from the ceiling, no damp-loving moss or ferns. The air, while dry, carried that persistent, unsettling metallic organic smell, stronger than outside, a scent that felt deeply alien, like a biological process from another planet. It made the fur on Laurie's arms rise, a primal warning that screamed wrong. The lack of natural light was absolute. Their small, battery-powered headlamps cut weak cones through the darkness, illuminating only small sections of the unnatural walls. Even with their enhanced night vision, the blackness felt heavier here, more profound, as if it actively resisted their sight. It pressed in on them, a suffocating weight that amplified the growing sense of claustrophobia. Their animal instincts, honed over years of survival in the wild, screamed in protest. Every hair stood on end, not from cold, but from a deep instinctual terror that had nothing to do with bears or human hunters. This place felt wrong. Fundamentally, existentially wrong. Caleb shifted nervously behind them. Laurie heard his quickened breathing, felt the tension coiling in his muscles. Even his brute strength and confidence felt flimsy in this oppressive alien space. He was used to fighting things he saw, smelled, and understood on some animal level. This fell outside his frame of reference. Ellis, though, seemed less affected by the oppressive atmosphere, or perhaps just more focused on the pull. She moved with a strange, almost somnambulant grace, her head tilted, listening to the internal compass that guided her. The hum was loudest around her, pulsing outwards. She didn't need a light source. She moved with an unnerving certainty, her eyes distant, fixed on the unseen source of the vibration. "This isn't natural," Laurie murmured, shining her light along a wall that subtly undulated in the weak beam. "It feels like walking inside something," Caleb said, his voice tight. "It is," Ellis whispered, not turning around. "Kind of." The cave system wound downwards, following a gentle slope that felt less like the result of erosion, and more like a deliberate path. They passed through narrower sections where the smooth walls felt slick under their fingertips, then into wider chambers where the bizarre growths clustered thicker on the walls and ceiling. The air grew steadily warmer as they descended, but it remained unnervingly dry. Ellis stopped abruptly at the edge of a drop-off. Below them, the hum was significantly louder, the vibration more intense. It felt like standing above a giant, sleeping heart. The path continued down, a steep decline into deeper darkness. "Down there," Ellis said, pointing into the blackness. "It's strongest there." Laurie hesitated. Going deeper felt incredibly foolish. Every fiber of her being warned against it. But the pull, even for her, was undeniable now. A morbid curiosity mixed with the growing certainty that this was important, for reasons she couldn't articulate. Ellis already started down, scrabbling for handholds on the unnaturally smooth rock. They descended into the lower chamber. It was vast, much larger than the passages above. The ceiling was lost in the darkness, but the floor was relatively flat, sloping gently towards one end. And in the center of this immense chamber, where the hum was loudest, where the vibrations became almost a physical pressure, they saw it. Their lights found it first, weak beams playing across its surface. It was enormous, filling a significant portion of the chamber, merging with the rock walls and floor as if it had grown organically from the stone itself. It wasn't rock. It wasn't metal. It was other. It presented as an irregular, sprawling mass, vaguely bulbous and asymmetrical. Its surface was a disturbing blend of textures, smooth and slick in places, ridged and knotty in others, with patches that looked like dried, cracked mud or flaking bark, but of some unknown material. And it pulsed, not like a heartbeat, but a slow, heavy, internal swelling and receding, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the vibration they felt in the air and earth. It gave off a faint, sickly luminescence, a dull, throbbing light that was somewhere between pale green and bruised purple. It wasn't enough to illuminate the chamber, just enough to reveal its own hideous form in the oppressive darkness. The metallic organic smell was overpowering here, thick and cloying, making them gag. It looked wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong, like an organ ripped from some colossal alien body and left to fester in the dark, or like a cancerous growth that had somehow infested the very bones of the earth. It was terrifying, yes, but not in the way a bear or a human hunter was terrifying. This was a horror that went deeper, striking at something primal, something that felt like a betrayal of the natural world. Lori felt her human skin crawl, felt the powerful, instinctive urge to shed it, to shift into her other form, the wolf, and run howling from this place. But even the thought felt wrong here. The raw, untamed power of the wolf felt insignificant, perhaps even vulnerable, in the face of this silent, pulsing mass. Caleb made a sound, a low, choked gasp that was closer to a whimper than a growl. He stumbled back a step, eyes wide, fixed on the pulsating thing. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, animal fear. Ellis stood frozen at the edge of the chamber, her face pale in the faint, sickly glow. The distant look had vanished from her eyes. They were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. This wasn't a source of power. It wasn't a hidden den of some ancient, noble creature. This was a mistake, a blight, a thing that did not belong. Their instincts screamed it. The deep animal revulsion that seized them was undeniable. This was not kin. This was other. And seeing it, feeling its wrongness, they knew with chilling certainty that their lives, already lived on the edge of the world, had just taken a terrifying, irreversible turn into true, unspeakable darkness. The pulsing heart of the mountain wasn't just calling them. It was acknowledging them. And it was waking up. For a long moment they simply stared, frozen in the dim, sickening glow of the pulsating mass. The hum was a physical weight in the air, the metallic smell thick and suffocating. Their instincts, raw and screaming, demanded flight. But the sheer horrifying presence of the object held them rooted to the spot. Caleb was the first to break the spell, though not with deliberate action. He stumbled forward, closer to the edge of the chamber, drawn despite his obvious terror. A strange, morbid fascination flickered in his eyes, a pull that warred with the animal revulsion. Perhaps it was the lure of power, misinterpreted, or just the shock of something so utterly alien. Lori reached out instinctively, a warning sound on her lips, but she was too slow. Caleb, perhaps reaching out a hand for balance on the uneven floor, or perhaps driven by a foolish, aggressive curiosity, grazed the surface of the pulsating mass. The contact was instantaneous, visceral. There was no heat, no shock, not in the way they understood it. Just a feeling. A strange, almost viscous pressure. A quickening pulse under his fingertips, like touching something living but utterly alien. Then, everything happened at once. The object reacted violently. It pulsed with a sudden, furious intensity. The sickly glow flared, blindingly bright, a silent explosion of wrong color that seemed to pierce the darkness of the cave, and the darkness inside their own skulls. The hum in the air intensified exponentially, rising to a pitch that was physically painful, vibrating not just their bones, but their very cells. It wasn't a sound their ears registered fully, but a resonance that shook them to their core. The air crackled with energy, cold and sharp. Lori felt it slam into her, a non-physical force that threw her back a step, stealing her breath. It was like being hit by lightning, but without the burn. Pure, raw energy, utterly alien. The effect on them was immediate and terrifying. Their senses, always hyperacute, went haywire. Their hearing exploded, every faint sound from the cave walls or the world outside magnified to an unbearable roar. The metallic organic smell became a physical assault, choking them, burning their nostrils. Their sight, used to the dim light, was overloaded by the object's sudden glare, leaving swirling afterimages and blinding spots. But it wasn't just sensory overload. Something fundamental shifted inside them. Their connection to their animal nature, the source of their strength and speed, felt wrong, distorted. Their muscles felt sluggish, heavy, as if fighting against an unseen current. The familiar hum of their regenerative abilities felt frayed, stuttering. It was like their very essence had been momentarily scrambled, their werewolf abilities thrown out of alignment by the object's energy burst. Ellis cried out, a thin, reedy sound lost in the overwhelming hum. She stumbled forward, clutching her head. Her eyes rolled back for a moment, wide and showing the whites. She wasn't just feeling the energy, she was receiving something from it. "No," she gasped, falling to her knees. "No, no, no!" Her voice trembled, filled with dawning horror. "It's not power, not strength." She looked at the pulsing object, her face pale and slick with sweat. "It's a mistake, an error. It shouldn't be here." She squeezed her eyes shut, trembling violently. The voices, they're clearer now, louder. It's an infection, a distortion. It wasn't meant to touch anything living. Her words, barely audible over the receding hum, landed like stones hitting cold water. An infection? A distortion? Not a source of strength, but an error. It clawed at everything they knew about themselves, about what they were. As the blinding flash faded and the unbearable hum subsided, the object did not return to its former state. It continued to pulse with greater intensity now, its sickly glow noticeably brighter. And as they watched, paralyzed by fear and the dawning horror of Ellis's words, subtle changes became apparent. Along the edges where the object met the cave walls, faint, almost invisible tendrils began to extend, thin as spider silk, probing outwards. They seemed to melt into the rock itself, vanishing from sight almost as soon as they appeared. but leaving a lingering sense of seeking. The air in the chamber felt different now, charged with residual energy, heavy with the cloying metallic smell. And layered beneath the physical sensations, something new, something cold and utterly alien, settled over them. It wasn't just the dread of the object itself. It was the distinct, unmistakable feeling of being noticed. Lori felt it first as a prickling on the back of her neck, the kind of feeling one gets when someone stares from across a room. But this wasn't human attention. It was cold, calculating, utterly without emotion. It felt like a lens had focused on them from somewhere far away, somewhere unseen, and had just registered their existence. Caleb stumbled back again, his eyes darting nervously towards the cave entrance. Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Ellis, still on her knees, nodded slowly. "They know," she breathed, looking not at the object but towards the world outside. The keepers. They know it's awake, and they know we're here." The keepers? What was she talking about? Lori's mind reeled. This place, this thing, Ellis's terrifying pronouncements. It was too much. But the cold, clinical sensation of being observed, of being marked, was undeniable. They had stumbled into something vast and terrible, something that had been hidden for God knows how long, and by touching it, by waking it up, they had painted a target on their backs. The deep wilderness of Yellowstone, their sanctuary, suddenly felt impossibly small, exposed. The hunt had begun, and they were the prey. They scrambled out of the hidden entrance, pushing through the thick steam, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The metallic smell clung to them like a shroud. Back in the valley of steam and sighs, the air felt cooler, cleaner, but the sense of dread was worse than ever. The blinding flash from the cave must have been visible for miles, even through the steam. Whatever they had woken, whatever they had attracted, knew exactly where to look. As soon as they cleared the steam shroud, their enhanced senses, still buzzing and distorted from the object's energy, picked up something wrong. It wasn't a smell or a sound, not in the usual way. It was an absence. The familiar sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of birds, the distant cry of a hawk, were muted, strangely absent in the immediate vicinity. And the smells, pine, earth, sulfur, seemed overlaid with a faint, sterile odor that didn't belong. Then they saw the tracks. Perfect, regular boot prints in the damp earth near the edge of the steam. Too clean, too evenly spaced to be hikers or rangers. They seemed to appear from nowhere, as if the people who made them had simply materialized. Lori knelt, examining one. The sole pattern was unlike anything she recognized, and there was no sign of scuff marks, no displaced stones, nothing to indicate a normal human walking. The prints were simply there. Ellis made a sound, pointing towards a rock face. Faint, almost invisible markings were etched into the stone, geometric patterns that shimmered faintly in the daylight. They weren't graffiti, weren't ancient petroglyphs. They looked technical, like calibration marks. "They're here," Ellis whispered, her voice tight. "The keepers." They followed the energy signature. They moved quickly, trying to put distance between themselves and the steaming valley, constantly scanning their surroundings. That's when they saw them. They were far off at first, figures moving through the trees on a distant ridge. Not a search party. Search parties were noisy, spread out, calling to each other. These figures moved with unnerving silence and precision. Perhaps half a dozen of them fanned out, dressed in dark, practical gear that seemed to blend seamlessly with the environment. They didn't look like military personnel or law enforcement officers. Their movements were fluid, economical, inhumanly synchronized. They moved as if they were part of a single vast organism, flowing through the difficult terrain with impossible ease. Lori ducked behind a thick stand of pines, pulling Caleb and Ellis down with her. They watched the figures through the needles, a cold knot of fear tightening in Lori's stomach. These weren't just humans. Something was deeply wrong about them. They moved too quietly, saw too much. Even at this distance, Lori felt the weight of their attention, that same cold, impersonal focus she'd felt in the cave. They saw flashes of something metallic or glass glinting in the sun, not binoculars, but something else. Then, a faint, almost inaudible buzzing sound came from overhead. Lori looked up, shielding her eyes. She saw it then, a small dark shape hovering almost invisibly against the blue sky. An unmanned aerial vehicle, but unlike any she'd ever seen. It was silent, almost perfectly still, its surface somehow absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. It simply hung there, watching, observing. The realization hit Lori with the force of a physical blow. These weren't hunters looking for rogue shifters. They weren't interested in them as werewolves. They were interested in the place, in the object. And they knew that they had been inside, that they had touched it, woken it. They weren't the target, not primarily. They were contaminants, variables, threats to be contained or eliminated not because of what they were, but because of what they knew, and what they might have become by touching the object. Ellis, watching the figures on the ridge, shivered violently. "They're ancient," she breathed. "The voices in the earth, they know them. Keepers. They've been watching this place for a long, long time, keeping it quiet. Ancient keepers." It sounded like something out of a myth, but seeing these figures move, seeing their strange, silent technology, Lori didn't doubt Ellis for a second. These weren't the superstitious humans with silver bullets her kind had sometimes faced. These weren't fanatical shifter hunters with their own twisted agendas. These were something else entirely. Something older, colder, more precise. Their lack of emotion was terrifying. They weren't driven by hate or fear, but by a singular, relentless purpose. Containment. Eradication of anything that interfered with that. The figures on the ridge began to move again, not towards them directly, but fanning out, beginning a systematic sweep of the area around the steaming valley. They moved with a methodical efficiency that chilled Lori to the bone. They weren't tracking random prey. They were executing a grid search, closing a net. Their sanctuary was gone. The vast, wild spaces of Yellowstone, which had felt like an infinite shield, now felt like a meticulously mapped-out cage. Every tree, every rock, every thermal vent was a hiding place, yes, but it was also a dead end. They were trapped in the heart of the beast, and something ancient and terrible hunted them with silent, implacable intent. "We have to move," Lori whispered, urgency burning in her chest. Now. Getting out of the valley, back towards more familiar ground, proved treacherous. The steam, which they had used as a shield to enter, now felt like a liability, hindering their sight while not hindering their pursuers. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to hide a waiting figure. The metallic smell from the cave still clung to them, a beacon advertising where they had been. They moved as fast as they dared, pushing through brush, scrambling over rocks, their muscles screaming in protest. The oppressive sense of being watched was constant, a weight on their shoulders. They ran, but it didn't feel like escape. It felt like they simply prolonged the inevitable, buying minutes or hours against an enemy that did not tire, did not make mistakes, and knew this place perhaps even better than they did. The deadly game of cat and mouse had begun, and they were the terrified mice, trapped in a maze they no longer understood. The whispers of the wild had turned into the silent, unnerving hum of something ancient and relentless closing in. The chase became less a sprint and more a brutal, exhausting endurance test. The keepers did not charge or crash through the underbrush. They moved with terrifying patience, a systematic progression that felt utterly relentless. They were a tide, slowly but surely rising, threatening to engulf them. Lori pushed them towards the roughest terrain she knew. Steep, unstable slopes, dense thickets of lodge poles where fallen trees crisscrossed the ground in chaotic tangles, narrow canyons carved by ancient water flow. They used their agility, their knowledge of the wild, to gain ground. They scrambled up rock faces impassable for humans, slipped through narrow crevices, vaulted over fallen timber. But the keepers matched their pace, their movements fluid and unnaturally efficient, as if the difficult ground did not impede them in the same way. The geothermal areas became both a curse and a potential hiding place. The dense steam offered momentary concealment, allowing them to vanish from sight, but moving through it remained risky. The ground was unstable, the air thick with choking fumes, the heat debilitating. The constant hissing and gurgling of the thermal features made it impossible to hear anything else, leaving them vulnerable. They would crouch beside a boiling mud pot, the smell of sulfur burning their lungs, the heat radiating through their clothes, hoping the steam concealed them from the silent, unmanned aerial vehicles they sometimes heard overhead, or the figures moving just yards away through the mist. The paranoia became a physical weight. Every snapped twig that wasn't theirs, every rustle of leaves that wasn't the wind, every distant animal call seemed to signal the keeper's presence. Lori's senses, still reeling from the object's energy pulse, felt both hypersensitive and unreliable. Were those truly footsteps behind them, or just the blood pounding in her ears? Was that a glimpse of dark clothing through the trees, or just a trick of the light? The constant uncertainty gnawed at their nerves, eroding their ability to think clearly. They had not slept properly since entering the cave, perhaps longer. Exhaustion had set in, dulling their reflexes, blurring the edges of reality. They stumbled upon one of the keeper's strange devices tucked between some rocks, a small, dark, metallic sphere that hummed with a low, almost inaudible energy. It was cool to the touch, its surface perfectly smooth. It felt utterly alien. Lori did not know what it did. A scanner, a tracker, something worse? They left it undisturbed, not wanting to alert its masters, but seeing it sitting there, silent and watchful, amplified the feeling of being surrounded, observed. Close calls mounted. Moments where they froze, pressed flat against the earth as the silent figures moved past within shouting distance. Lori saw their faces in those moments, impassive, emotionless, eyes scanning the terrain with unsettling thoroughness. They weren't looking for signs of disturbance, but for them, it felt like being hunted by robots or something even less human. There was no malice in their gaze, no anger, just cold, focused purpose. It was more terrifying than any snarl or bared teeth. They tried to break the pursuit, using the tricks of their kind. They waded upstream in cold creeks to mask their scent, moved across stretches of bare rock where they left no tracks, backtracked and laid false trails. But the keepers anticipated their moves, or perhaps their technology cut through such simple deceptions. The silent, unmanned aerial vehicle sometimes appeared, hovering overhead for a moment before moving on, its unseen gaze chilling. The toll of the flight was heavy. Their bodies, capable of incredible feats of endurance and recovery, were pushed to the absolute limit. Muscles screamed, joints ached. They were bruised and scraped from scrambling over rough ground. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the inability to shift into their full wolf forms was a crippling handicap. Shifting was too risky, too visible, too likely to be detected by whatever strange senses or technology the keepers possessed. They were trapped in their weaker, two-legged forms, relying on fragments of their animal speed and agility. It felt like running a marathon with lead weights tied to their ankles. The sense of being cornered grew stronger with every hour. They were pushed deeper into a specific section of the park, a basin surrounded by impassable cliffs and heavily monitored thermal areas. Every potential escape route seemed blocked, either by the terrain itself or by the quiet, persistent presence of the keepers. It began to feel less like a random chase and more like a deliberate herding. They weren't just chased. They were guided towards something. The truth, chilling and stark, dawned on Lori as she studied the map again, tracing their path, their options. All viable routes out of the basin, all the less dangerous terrain, were systematically cut off. Only one place offered any potential cover, any complex geography that might afford them a chance to hide, to rest, to perhaps even fight back. It was the one place they least wanted to go. The valley of steam and sighs, the place where they had found the object, the source of the hum, the smell, the nightmare. The place that had attracted the keepers in the first place. It seemed impossible. Why would the keepers herd them back towards the source of the problem? Unless the keepers weren't just trying to catch them. Unless they had a different plan. Unless going back to the heart of the nightmare was the only path left open. A wave of dread washed over Lori, colder and deeper than any fear the chase had inspired. They were pushed towards the only place that could explain everything. The place that held the terrible truth. The place that was now saturated with the presence of the object and the keepers. The forest, their trusted friend, had become a funnel, guiding them relentlessly towards the one spot that promised not salvation, but a final, terrifying confrontation. The air, thick with sulfur and steam, felt suddenly heavy, charged with a silent, unbearable anticipation. They were going back to where it began. The exhaustion was a dull ache in Ellis's bones, but it was overridden by the relentless pressure in her skull, the low, persistent hum that vibrated directly within her brain. Since touching the object, her unique connection to the earth, to the unseen currents that flowed beneath the surface, had intensified to a painful degree. The vibrations she felt were no longer just a physical sensation. They were layered with impressions, with echoes of something ancient and vast. The voices she'd spoken of became clearer, though still not like human speech. They were bursts of feeling, flashes of distorted imagery, fragments of sensation that seemed to rise from the very rock and soil around her. It was like listening to a corrupted recording of something that had happened eons ago. It was a torment, a constant barrage on her senses, but she couldn't block it out. It was fused with the hum of the object, with the cold presence of the keepers. She began to piece it together, wrestling with the alien language of the Earth's memory. The object wasn't rooted in the rock like a mineral deposit. It had arrived. It had penetrated the Earth, drawn perhaps by the immense geothermal power of the Yellowstone caldera, using the deep geological fault lines as pathways. It was something that didn't belong here, a profound disruption to the natural order. The images came in jarring flashes, a slow, inexorable descent through blackness, a feeling of being other, utterly alien, contact with something alive, a sudden violent wrongness as it spread. The earliest echoes felt like a scream, a desperate, localized resistance from the life it encountered. Then came the horrifying realization. The object wasn't a source of power, or some natural but undiscovered phenomenon. It was a contagion, a parasite, a form of life, or energy, or consciousness that was fundamentally incompatible with terrestrial biology, but which sought to assimilate or overwrite it. The most terrifying truth, the one that made Ellis's stomach clench with nausea, was that the initial effect of this infection wasn't what they knew as lycanthropy. The Earth memories showed glimpses of the true transformation, a monstrous, grotesque distortion of living tissue, twisting forms into shapes that were utterly alien, horrific, unrecognizable as anything from this world. These were the first forms, the raw, unmitigated outcome of contact with the object. Their wolf forms, the strength and speed they relied upon, the moon cycle shift, it wasn't the intended result. It was a mutation, a deviation. Perhaps the Earth itself, or the organisms it first infected, had somehow fought back, developed a resistance. Their lycanthropy, their familiar transformation into wolves, was a damaged, compromised version of the full, monstrous change. It was a side effect, a survival mechanism perhaps, or a failed defense that still allowed for a semblance of form and, crucially, retained the mind. Their werewolf nature, the thing that had defined them, that had made them outcasts and hunters, was nothing more than a twisted, partial manifestation of an ancient alien plague. The understanding settled over Ellis like a shroud of cold, metallic dust. They weren't children of the moon or inheritors of a mystical power. They were victims of an ancient infection, their very being a corrupted offshoot of something that shouldn't exist. Then came the echoes associated with the keepers. They weren't random hunters. The Earth memories showed them appearing long, long ago, drawn to the initial outbreak. They weren't fighting the infected creatures, not in a battle of predator against prey. They were containing, sealing. Their methods were systematic, brutal, focused on limiting the spread of the object and its horrifying primary effect. They were guardians, yes, but of a terrible secret, not of life. Their goal was isolation, eradication, prevention. Ellis saw glimpses of their methods in the Earth's memory, not silver bullets, but something else, something that targeted the wrongness itself, that could disrupt the connection to the object, perhaps even reverse or halt the monstrous transformation if caught early enough. Their technology, the strange hum and pulses, were tools of containment developed over millennia. Their emotionless efficiency wasn't cruelty. It was the chilling dedication of ancient sentinels who had seen the true horror and understood the stakes. The revelation became a scream trapped in Ellis's chest. The keepers weren't their enemy because they hunted werewolves. They were their enemy because they were trying to clean up a mess that was werewolves, or rather the source of them. And anyone who had come into contact with the source, who carried its taint, was a potential vector, a threat to be neutralized. She had to tell Lori and Caleb. She had to make them understand. This wasn't about escaping hunters. It was about something cosmic and terrifying. But the words felt clumsy, inadequate. How could she explain the whispers of the earth, the fragmented images, the chilling certainty that had settled upon her? They huddled under an overhang as dusk gathered, the air still thick with the scent of sulfur and the strange metallic tang. Ellis, trembling with exhaustion and the weight of the truth, tried to speak. It's not what we thought," she whispered, looking from Lori's weary face to Caleb's impatient, fearful eyes. "The object, it's not natural. It came from somewhere else. And the change, it's not a gift. It's what happens when living things touch it. It's an infection." Caleb stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "Infection? What are you talking about, El?" "Our form, the wolf. It's a deviation," Ellis rushed on, the words tumbling out, fueled by frantic urgency. "The real change is monstrous. Horrible. The wolf. It's a later thing, a mistake of the mistake. A partial resistance." Lori listened, her brow furrowed, her gaze sharp. She saw the terror in Ellis's eyes, the absolute conviction. "And the keepers," Ellis continued, lowering her voice. "They're not like other hunters. They know about it, the object. They've been guarding against it, containing it, maybe for thousands of years. They saw what it did before the wolf form happened. They're here to make sure it doesn't spread. And we touched it. We woke it up. We're exposed." Caleb burst out laughing, a harsh, humorless sound. "Infection? Guardians? You're out of your mind, Ellis. This is our strength. This is who we are. You're hearing things." He jabbed a finger towards the direction of the steaming valley. "That thing in the cave, that felt like power. Raw, untamed power. Maybe that's the real source. Maybe that's what makes us strong." Lori held up a hand, stopping Caleb's tirade. She looked at Ellis, saw the truth etched on her face. Lori didn't understand it all, the ancient keepers, the parasitic origin. But she understood the look in Ellis's eyes. She understood the primal wrongness of the object. And she understood the cold, implacable efficiency of the keepers. "Power?" Lori said, her voice flat, aimed at Caleb. That felt like sickness, like something rotten. "And those things hunting us, they move like death. They move like something that understands that power." Caleb argued back, his voice rising. "They're probably trying to keep it for themselves, keep us from it. They're trying to keep it from getting out." Ellis cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's a plague, Caleb, not a blessing. We're a symptom." The raw, horrifying truth hung in the air between them. Their identity, their history, their very nature, shattered by Ellis's frantic words. Were they apex predators, children of the wild night? Or a mutated side effect of an alien contamination? The chasm that opened between Caleb's desperate denial, Lori's wary acceptance, and Ellis's burdened knowledge felt wider than any canyon in the park. The family unit, forged in exile, began to crack under the weight of an unbearable truth. The revelation about their origin, delivered in Ellis's trembling voice under the vast, indifferent sky, did not unite them. It tore them apart. The terrible knowledge acted like a corrosive agent on the fragile bonds they had forged in isolation. Caleb's reaction was immediate, visceral, and absolute. He rejected Ellis's words with a ferocity that bordered on violence. For years his werewolf nature had been his identity, his pride, the source of his strength and independence. The idea that it was merely a mutation, an infection, a mistake from an alien blight, was an assault on his very being. It stripped him bare, leaving him feeling weak and insignificant. He clung to the idea of the object as a source of power, a raw, primordial energy they could tap into, because the alternative was unthinkable. He saw Ellis's words not as truth, but as a form of madness, or worse, a deliberate attempt to undermine him, to take away the one thing that made him feel powerful and real. His denial served as a shield against a truth too horrifying to bear. Lori, while shaken to her core by Ellis's conviction and the unsettling implications, could not afford the luxury of philosophical despair. Her mind immediately went to survival. If Ellis was right, if that thing in the cave was a danger, and if the keepers were ancient, relentless forces trying to contain it, then their immediate problem was simply escaping. The origin of their condition, while existentially terrifying, felt secondary to the cold, hard reality of being hunted by something that moved like death and knew how to seal off the entire park. The object had brought the keepers, and the keepers were the immediate, physical threat. Escape remained her sole focus. Ellis carried the heaviest burden. Not only did she have to grapple with the horrifying implications of her discovery, but her connection to the earth and the object seemed to be deepening, amplifying the voices, the vibrations, the sense of wrongness. She felt not just fear, but a growing sense of responsibility. She had led them to the object, had, however, inadvertently helped wake it up. Now she felt an urgent, desperate need to understand its true nature and find a way to stop it from spreading, to prevent the mistake from repeating itself. Her focus shifted from their own survival to the containment of the threat itself, a goal that seemed both impossible and necessary. The stress of constant flight, combined with the proximity to the activated object, and the sheer horror of the revelation, amplified their animal instincts, but not in a helpful way. Their more primal natures, normally kept in check by their human minds and their pack dynamic, began to fray at the edges. Caleb became more aggressive, reckless, prone to sudden flashes of anger and distrust. He paced like a caged wolf, his eyes wild. Lori withdrew into herself, becoming more cautious, more suspicious. Her focus narrowed to the immediate path, the next hiding place. Ellis became more distant, more immersed in the unseen world of vibrations and echoes, sometimes speaking in riddles, her gaze often lost. The argument started quietly, fueled by exhaustion and fear, then escalated into shouting matches, echoing through the silent woods. "It's insane, Elle," Caleb roared, his voice hoarse. "Ancient guardians, alien infections. It's some fever dream. That thing is power. You felt it. We just need to figure out how to control it." "Control it?" Ellis cried back, her voice trembling. "You felt it distort us. It made our own bodies feel wrong. It's not power, Caleb. It's corruption. It turns things into monsters." "And what do you think we are now?" Caleb shot back. a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "We're already monsters to them, to the humans, to the other packs. At least this way, we could be something more. Something strong." "Strength isn't worth this," Lori cut in, her voice low and firm. "Whatever that thing is, it brought the keepers down on us. They're the problem right now. We need to get out, find a way out of the park." "And go where?" Caleb sneered. "Back to hiding? Back to running? If that thing is the source, maybe it's the only way we ever stop running. Maybe it's the answer. The answer is buried deep underground, where it can't hurt anything." Ellis countered, her voice rising in desperation. "The keepers know that. That's why they're trying to seal it. Or maybe they're trying to keep it from us." Caleb insisted, digging his heels in. "Maybe they're the real enemy. They're the ones hunting us, not that thing. They're hunting the taint." Ellis sobbed. "They're hunting us because we touched it. Because we're exposed. And if we go back to it, if you try to take that power, you'll become one of those other things. The ones they sealed away long ago." The raw, horrifying truth hung in the air between them. Their identity, their history, their very nature shattered by Ellis's frantic words. The chasm that opened between Caleb's desperate denial, Lori's wary acceptance, and Ellis's burdened knowledge felt wider than any canyon in the park. The family unit, forged in exile, cracked under the weight of an unbearable truth. The lack of sleep, the constant fear, the strain of the chase, and the shattering truth wore them down. The easy camaraderie, the quiet understanding that had been their strength as outcasts, evaporated. Suspicion crept in. Caleb looked at Ellis as if she were deranged. Lori looked at Caleb with a mixture of fear and exasperation. Ellis looked at both of them with a desperate, heartbreaking urgency they couldn't fully grasp. By the time the last light faded from the sky, painting the ragged peaks in shades of bruised purple and gray, they were no longer a family. They were three individuals, trapped, terrified, and fundamentally at odds, facing an unspeakable enemy in a wilderness that had turned against them. Their unity, their greatest weapon, was shattered, leaving them exposed and vulnerable as the silent, relentless tide of the keepers continued its methodical advance, pushing them inevitably towards the heart of the nightmare. The keepers' tactics shifted. The systematic sweep intensified. No longer a slow search, but a deliberate press. They moved with increased speed and coordination. Their presence felt more acutely, a tightening coil around the basin where they were trapped. It was like being hunted by a single intelligent organism that anticipated their every move. They no longer had the luxury of choosing their path. Every direction they tried to take, every likely escape route out of the thermal basin, was blocked. Steep canyons they might have navigated before seemed impassable, their mouths guarded by unseen presences or marked by those faint geometric symbols the keepers used. Rivers they might have crossed were patrolled by silent, dark shapes moving along the banks with unnerving speed. It felt less like running from hunters and more like being guided, pushed relentlessly towards a single predetermined point. The keepers began to use their strange capabilities more openly. It wasn't conventional weaponry. They weren't shooting bullets or nets. Their attacks were targeted. A sudden, intense pressure in the air, like an invisible wall slamming into them, knocking the wind out of their lungs and leaving them momentarily disoriented. A low-frequency hum, different from the object's pulse but equally disturbing, seemed to vibrate inside their skulls, causing blinding headaches and disrupting their ability to concentrate, to think, to even hold on to their human form fluidly. It wasn't lethal, not outright, but it was effective, debilitating, a way to wear them down, to keep them off balance, to nudge them in the desired direction. Lori felt a searing pain flash through her arm as she scrambled over a rock, a pain not caused by the fall itself, but seemed to originate from within her muscles, disrupting her balance. Caleb stumbled at the edge of a creek, doubled over, clutching his head as a wave of resonant energy washed over him, leaving him nauseated and weak. Ellis, already burdened by the object's voices, proved most sensitive to these attacks, sometimes freezing mid-stride, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. Anywhere they might have found temporary refuge was now compromised. The small caves or rock overhangs they had used for shelter were either too exposed or seemed to hold the faint, sterile scent of the keepers having already passed through them. The familiar comfort of a hidden den was gone. They were exposed, vulnerable, with nowhere left to hide. The psychological pressure was immense. The keepers didn't necessarily stay within sight, but their presence was a constant, suffocating weight. Sometimes Lori heard a sound just at the edge of hearing, a faint click or whir that wasn't natural. Other times, she simply felt it, the chilling certainty of being watched, assessed, tracked. It was a silent, unending siege that wore away at their already frayed nerves, amplifying their fear and the cracks between them. They were funneled. There was no denying it anymore. Every blocked path, every directed pulse of energy, every fleeting glimpse of dark-clad figures reinforced the terrible truth. Only one direction remained for them to go, one place that offered terrain complex enough that the keepers might not be able to corner them immediately. One place they might potentially lose themselves in the confusion. It was the place they had desperately wanted to leave behind. The Valley of Steam and Sighs. The source of the object. The hidden cave. Going back felt like walking into the mouth of hell. Lori already felt the dread mounting in her stomach as they were pushed closer. The air grew thicker, the smell of sulfur stronger, and beneath it, the metallic organic tang that clung to her senses like grave dust. The hum of the object, which had faded slightly with distance, began to grow again, felt deeper in her body, a physical thrum that resonated with the frantic beat of her heart. Caleb, despite his earlier bravado about the object being a source of power, was clearly terrified. He kept glancing back the way they had come, his face pale and drawn. The reckless anger had not vanished, but it was now edged with desperation. Ellis, however, seemed to gather a strange resolve the closer they got. The distress from the keeper attacks remained, but it was overlaid with a grim determination. The voices, the echoes, the understanding she'd gained, had shifted her focus. She wasn't running from the keepers anymore. She was drawn back towards the object, towards the source of the problem she now understood. The knowledge of where they were being driven stripped away the last vestiges of hope. This wasn't about escaping Yellowstone anymore. This was about whatever was going to happen when the hunters finally cornered them at the very epicenter of the horror they had uncovered. The cave, the source of their nightmare, became their only possible destination, the arena for the final, inevitable confrontation. As they moved closer, drawn into the heart of the thermal basin, the air grew heavy, thick with the terrible promise of what waited for them beneath the steam. The hum was a roar in their heads now, the metallic smell suffocating. They were home, in the worst possible way. The terrain around the valley of steam and sighs looked like the lip of a wound in the earth. Jagged rocks rose from the ground, slick with condensation from the ever-present steam. Mud pots gurgled and spat, their viscous surfaces bubbling with malevolent intent. The air was thick, hot, and reeked of sulfur, the metallic organic tang from the cave now a distinct, nauseating layer underneath. They were pushed right to the edge of the steam shroud that concealed the hidden entrance. Behind them, the silent pressure of the keepers intensified. There was nowhere left to run. They were cornered, exhausted, terrified, and fractured by their conflicting fears and knowledge. Laurie's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her muscles screamed from days of flight. Her senses were a painful mess of conflicting input, the overwhelming smells, the distorting hum, the constant feeling of being watched. But overriding the fear was a surge of fierce, protective instinct. Caleb and Ellis, she would fight for them, even here, even against these things. The first of the keepers emerged from the swirling steam, moving with that same unnerving silence and precision. More of them now, perhaps 10 or 12, fanning out in a loose semicircle at the edge of the clearing. They wore the same dark, featureless gear, their faces obscured by visors or simply lacking expression. They held their strange devices, not guns, but tools of containment and disruption. The air crackled with anticipation. This was not a hunt ending in a capture. This was a confrontation. The keepers had not just herded them. They had brought them back to the source, perhaps to deal with them here, where the unleashed energy of the object might somehow factor into their containment plan. The battle began not with a charge or a shout, but with a silent, synchronized action from the keepers. Several of them raised their devices and beams of strange, pulsating light lanced out. The beams weren't solid, but flickered with contained energy. They didn't burn or tear, but impacted with a force that slammed into the werewolves, sending them staggering. Laurie felt a beam strike her chest, knocking her back onto the wet, slippery ground. It wasn't just physical force, it was a disruption. Her muscles spasmed, locking up for a moment. The familiar, comforting warmth of her own body felt wrong, alien. It targeted the change, disrupting the very structure of her being. She fought against the debilitating effect, pushing herself back up, snarling. Caleb, ignoring Laurie's shouted warnings, let out a frustrated roar and launched himself forward, shifting partially as he ran. His limbs elongated, fur began to sprout, his teeth sharpened into fangs. But the shift was wrong. It was painful, stuttering, incomplete. He became a grotesque, half-shifted figure, caught between human and wolf, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. A keeper aimed its device, and a wave of that disruptive hum washed over Caleb. He shrieked, a sound of pure agony and disorientation, his partially shifted form flickering uncontrollably as if caught in a broken signal. Ellis did not join the fray. She stood near the entrance of the steam-shrouded cave, her eyes wide, not watching the fight, but looking into the thick steam, towards the buried object. The low hum from within the earth was rising, mingling with the disruptive frequencies of the keeper's devices, creating a dissonant, unbearable symphony that scraped at their sanity. Deep inside the earth, or perhaps just within the hidden chamber, the object reacted to the violence above. Its pulsing intensified, a furious, rapid thrumming that shook the ground. The sickly glow from the steam shroud grew brighter, casting an eerie, pulsating light on the swirling mist. It felt excited, agitated. Then, from within the cave entrance, weaving through the steam, they appeared. Thin, translucent, faintly glowing tendrils, like pale roots or ethereal feelers. They emerged from the opening, probing the air tentatively, then rapidly extending, growing with unnerving speed. They weren't made of rock or plant matter. They seemed almost liquid, yet held a strange, defined shape. They were part of the object, reaching out, seeking contact, seeking spread. The keepers, seeing the tendrils emerge, shifted their focus. Some continued to contain and disrupt the struggling werewolves, but others turned their devices towards the cave entrance, directing beams of cold light at the probing tendrils. The tendrils recoiled slightly under the assault, but did not wither. Then came the sound, a high, piercing whine that began deep within the earth, emanating directly from the cave entrance. It wasn't just loud. It was the most agonizing sound Lori had ever heard. It bypassed the ears and vibrated through her skull, through her teeth, through her very core. It was a sound designed to shatter the mind, to break the spirit, to overload the senses. It targeted their animal nature, their connection to the earth, amplifying the wrongness they felt from the object 1,000-fold. Lori fell to her knees, clutching her head, teeth gritted against the unbearable resonance. Beside her, Caleb whimpered, collapsing entirely, his half-shifted form shimmering violently. But through the agony, through the blinding light and the shattering sound, Ellis's voice cut through, clear and urgent, directed not at Lori or Caleb, but at the keepers. "You're trying to seal it," she screamed, her voice raw. She looked past the fighting, past the terror, her eyes fixed on the keepers, directing their energy at the tendrils. "You're trying to push it back. Stop it getting out." In that moment, amidst the chaos and horror, Ellis understood. The keepers weren't their enemies in the way she had thought. Not truly. Their goal wasn't to hunt them, but to contain the source of the corruption, and by extension, to contain anything or anyone who had been tainted by it, who could facilitate its spread. Their cold, ruthless efficiency wasn't malice, but the desperate act of ancient custodians trying to lock away a cosmic plague. Their goals, in this single terrifying moment, aligned. Stop the object, prevent the spread. And Ellis, her mind screaming with the object's presence and the keeper's countermeasures, knew exactly what needed to happen. The cave, the object, the tendrils, the sickening hum, it all had to be buried. Permanently. The unbearable hum from the cave reached a crescendo, a physical tearing sensation inside their heads. The air vibrated violently. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Amidst the pandemonium of the keeper's attacks and the object's enraged pulsing, Ellis's voice, though strained, rang with a desperate clarity that cut through the noise. "Lori, Caleb, listen," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger towards the cave entrance where the translucent tendrils thrashed and sought purchase. "It's not them, not the keepers. It's that." She gestured wildly towards the source of the hum, the pulsing light within the steam. "It's trying to get out. They're trying to stop it. We have to seal it." Caleb, writhing on the ground under the disorienting effects of the keeper's energy weapons, and the object's hum barely heard her. His eyes, flickering between human and wolf-like, were fixed on the cave entrance, on the intensified glowing of the object. In his fear and confusion, twisted by his earlier conviction, he saw not a threat to be contained, but a power unbound. A chance. A desperate final grab at the strength he felt slipping away. With a guttural cry, fighting against the forces tearing at him, Caleb lurched to his feet and lunged towards the cave entrance, towards the heart of the nightmare. No. Lori screamed, scrambling to intercept him. Her own body felt wrong, sluggish, rebelling against her will, but the protective instinct was absolute. She would not let him throw himself into that. But she was too slow. Caleb reached the edge of the steam shroud, his hand reaching out towards the visible pulsing glow just inside the opening. He was driven by a desperate, misguided conviction, blind to the true horror. Then one of the keepers moved. Not towards Lori, not towards the other struggling figures, but directly towards Caleb. It moved with terrifying speed and grace, its dark form a blur against the steam. No weapon was raised, no beam of light fired. Instead, as it reached Caleb, a field of shimmering, intensely bright light erupted around them both, coalescing into a sphere, a cage of pure energy. Lori watched in frozen horror as the sphere enclosed Caleb and the keeper. Inside the light, Caleb's struggling form became visible for a moment, contorted, his eyes wide with a horror that finally seemed to eclipse his rage and denial. Then the light intensified, blindingly bright, and Caleb's form seemed to compress, to fade. He wasn't killed, not in the way Lori understood it. He was sealed, contained. The keeper was gone too, absorbed into the same sphere of light. It felt like they hadn't just captured him, but taken him, swept him away by a force that understood his exposure, his potential to spread the taint. Was he being studied? Quarantined? Or had the object already changed him beyond repair, requiring this extreme form of containment? His fate, sealed inside that disappearing ball of light, felt infinitely worse than a clean death. Lori stumbled back, reeling from the shock, the loss, the horrifying demonstration of the keeper's capabilities. But Ellis already moved, pulling at Lori's arm with surprising strength. Lori. Now. Ellis's eyes were wide with a fierce, desperate light. The rift. The thermal vents. We can bring it down. She dragged Lori towards a section of the basin near the cave entrance, where the ground was fractured and seethed with multiple smaller vents of steam and boiling water. The rock here felt unstable, honeycombed by the geothermal activity, and now the probing tendrils of the object felt through the vibrations in the ground. It's tied to the fault line, Ellis explained frantically, gesturing to the fractured rock, the steam, the cave entrance. The object. It's in the earth here. If we can trigger a collapse, send the hot water, the steam, down into the rift. It will seal it, bury it. She spoke of leveraging the park's own immense, violent power against the alien intrusion, directing the superheated steam, the boiling mud, the unstable rock into the heart of the fissure where the object resided. It was a suicidal plan. It meant triggering an avalanche of rock and scalding water right on top of themselves. The keepers, seeing Ellis's intent, seeing the shift in her focus from escape to destruction, reacted instantly. Their attacks on Lori intensified, No longer just disruptive pulses, but more directed, powerful bursts aimed at knocking her down, pinning her. Other keepers turned their attention to Ellis, trying to reach her, to stop her from manipulating the volatile ground. They did not want the object destroyed or buried in a chaotic collapse. They wanted it contained in their own controlled, methodical way. They were guardians of the secret, not exterminators of the threat itself, not if it meant losing the threat or disrupting their long-term plans. Ellis ignored them, her focus absolute. She scrambled onto a large, unstable rock near the most active vents, her small body trembling with effort and the strain of her connection to the place. "Lori, help me," she cried. Lori, fighting against the debilitating pulses from the keepers, clawed her way towards Ellis. She understood now. Ellis saw the bigger picture, the true scale of the threat. The object had to be stopped, even if it cost them everything. Ellis placed her hands flat against the hot, steaming rock, her eyes closed in fierce concentration. Lori saw a faint bluish light pulse under Ellis's skin where her hands met the stone. "It's tied in." Ellis gasped, her voice strained. "To the earth. I can anchor it. Hold it here. Stop it from pulling away." She used her own strange, deep connection, the very source of her intuitive abilities, against the object. Not to gain power, but to restrain it, to tether it to this spot, making it vulnerable to the impending collapse. It was an act of immense will, of pure, terrifying sacrifice. Lori saw the energy draining from Ellis, her face going slack with the effort. "Now, Lori." Ellis gasped, her voice fading. "The ground. Break the crust. Send the water down." Lori did not hesitate. Driven by grief for Caleb and a fierce, sudden clarity, she turned towards the most active vents, the ground trembling violently under her boots. Ignoring the keeper's attacks, she poured every ounce of her remaining strength into a single, desperate action. She clawed at the earth, not shifting, but using the raw, brute force of her human form, enhanced by adrenaline and despair. She kicked at the thin crust over a bubbling pool, slammed her fists against unstable rock. The ground gave way. A torrent of superheated steam and boiling mud erupted, instantly scalding, instantly lethal. But it wasn't just an eruption. It was directed downwards into the fracture, towards the source of the hum. Ellis, her hand still pressed against the rock, let out a final choked cry as the ground around her gave way. The bluish light under her skin flared once intensely, anchoring something deep beneath the surface, then vanished. The rock she stood on crumbled, swallowed by the cascade of steam, water, and falling debris. The last thing Lori saw before the world dissolved into chaos was Ellis, her eyes open, fixed on the sky, a strange, peaceful expression on her face, finally free of the hum and the voices. Then the earth screamed. The roar of the collapse was deafening. The ground bucked and tore, swallowed by a convulsion of geological violence. Boiling water surged, mud pots exploded, and tons of rock and earth poured down into the fractured opening, burying everything beneath. The unbearable hum from the object was abruptly cut off, replaced by the raw elemental sound of destruction. Steam billowed upwards in colossal plumes, hotter and thicker than anything they had witnessed before, turning the sky a blinding white. Lori was caught in the fringe of the collapse, thrown back by the force of the steam and falling rock. She scrambled, ducked, covered her head, the scalding air burning her skin, debris raining down around her. She did not know how she survived. Instinct, luck, the strange resilience of her altered body pushed to its limits propelled her forward by a wave of hot, muddy water, squeezing through a gap between two massive boulders as the ground shifted, narrowly avoiding being crushed. When the cacophony finally began to subside, replaced by a low, mournful hissing of steam and the settling groans of rock, Lori crawled from the debris. She was covered in mud and grit, her clothes torn, her body aching in 1,000 places. The air was thick with the pungent smell of sulfur, but overriding it now was that metallic organic scent from the cave, fainter but still present, like a lingering promise or a mocking echo. She looked back at where the steaming valley had been. Now it was a raw, ugly scar on the landscape. A fresh, immense mound of earth and rock covered the area where the cave entrance had been. Steam still rose from cracks in the new, unstable ground, carrying the familiar smell of sulfur and the unforgettable alien tang. The hum was gone. The sickening glow was gone. The surface manifestation of the nightmare seemed buried. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sounds of the wounded earth. The keepers were gone, vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, perhaps buried in the collapse, perhaps having retreated now that the immediate threat was contained, at least temporarily. Lori stood alone in the aftermath, shivering despite the residual heat. Alone. Caleb, sealed away in that horrifying sphere of light. Ellis, buried under tons of rock, her strange, brave heart finally still. They were gone. Her family was gone. She sank to her knees on the treacherous ground, the hot mud seeping through her torn pants, and wept. Not just for Caleb and Ellis, but for everything they had lost, for the shattering of their world, for the truth she now carried, a weight heavier than any rock. The truth that their lycanthropy wasn't a wild grace, but a twisted lineage from an alien plague. The truth that the keepers were ancient, implacable forces who knew about this, who would stop at nothing to contain it. The truth that she had seen the source, touched its periphery, helped bury it. She could not go back. Not to the world of humans, obviously, and not to the world of other shifters either. What could she tell them? That their power was a mistake? That they were symptoms of a cosmic infection? They would not believe her. Worse, they would see the buried object as a source of power they could somehow exploit, unleashing the true horror Ellis had glimpsed. No, the secret proved too dangerous. She was an outcast before, now she was an outcast of outcasts, burdened with a knowledge that could destroy everything. She had to disappear. Completely. From everyone. The wilderness remained her only option, but now it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. Weeks turned into months. Lori moved like an unseen presence through the deep back country, avoiding all signs of civilization, hunting only what was necessary, leaving no trace. The vastness of the land offered a lonely comfort. The raw beauty of the mountains, the clean scent of the pine forests, the rush of the rivers. They were reminders of the world she was fighting to protect, the world that remained blissfully ignorant of the horror buried deep beneath the earth. She tried to live as she always had, reduced to the essentials of survival. But something had changed, slowly, insidiously. She started noticing things in the dark. Lying awake under the stars, she caught a faint, almost imperceptible glow on her skin. Small patches, no bigger than a dime, that pulsed with that same sickly, pale green light she had seen on the object. It was faint, easily dismissed as tired eyes or a trick of moonlight. but it was there. Her dreams were no longer about hunting or running from humans. They were filled with swirling steam, unbearable hums, and fragmented images of the object, its tendrils reaching, seeking. She would wake up sweating, the metallic organic smell seeming to cling to the air around her, even deep in the pristine woods. Her senses, her werewolf senses that were her connection to the world, felt off, distorted. The clean, distinct smells of the forest, the damp earth after rain, the scent of game, the tang of pine resin were now overlaid with that persistent, alien metallic odor. It was faint most of the time, but it was always there, a subtle, sickening undercurrent that tainted everything. And the vibrations. The low, resonant hum from the object was gone, buried. But sometimes, especially when she was near areas with geothermal activity, she felt a faint echo of it, deep within the earth, but also deep within herself. A ghost vibration, a memory of the pulsing. One night, huddled by her small fire, she felt a patch of skin on her arm itch. She scratched it, and in the faint glow of the embers, she saw it. A small area on her forearm pulsed with that familiar, disturbing greenish light just for a second, then faded back to normal. Her breath hitched in her throat. The horrifying truth, the one that had been slowly dawning on her, solidified into an ice-cold certainty that pierced her to the bone. She wasn't just a survivor who knew the secret. She was a carrier. The brief, violent contact with the object, the energy burst, the lingering presence in the cave, it had left something behind. Not just memories or fear. A physical taint, a seed. She had not escaped unscathed. Part of the mistake, the distortion, had clung to her. She was now a potential vector, a walking threat, a living link to the horror buried beneath Yellowstone. The keepers, if they knew she survived, would hunt her not just for knowing, but for being. And the greatest threat wasn't even the relentless ancient guardians. It was herself. The growing dread of what might happen, what she might become, if the infection deep within her ever decided to fully bloom. Her life wasn't just solitary flight anymore. It was a desperate, terrifying race against time, against discovery, against the monstrous potential lurking in her own flesh and bone. She was the secret now, walking the earth, forever on the run from a world she couldn't rejoin, and a horror she carried within. The silence of the woods felt heavier than ever, filled not with peace, but with the quiet, constant thrum of a nightmare that was far from over.